Hello, good morning chaps, how are you? Welcome to my house, and I guess welcome to my YouTube channel. I have bitten the bullet and I have started a YouTube channel, and looking at the camera I've just also noticed that I have a window growing out of my head, so many apologies for that. I will fix that for next time. Obviously I'm not a professional YouTuber, I am an English teacher, so you'll forgive me, I hope, for that. So basically I've opened this channel so that we can continue our discourse. So not being a techie person, it might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing, but it will be a thing, whatever that means, okay? So basically the idea of this channel is that we can keep talking about things that we've been talking in class, even though there are things happening outside of the classroom that are a little bit beyond our control. And I think it's actually particularly relevant in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of the text that we've been looking at. For those of you who are actually not my students and have accidentally stumbled across this channel, I'm sure there's probably one or two that might happen. I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name is Michelle. I am a teacher at an international school in Bogotá, Colombia, and I have amazing IB students who are both in years 12 and year 13. And the idea is that we've had basically quite a lot of strike action over the last week or so, and the school's been closed. And so we've been kind of maintaining contact online, but obviously this is another dynamic, and it's a way of maintaining contact and generating, I guess, further discussion that is, I suppose, a little bit higher quality, is that the word? Maybe not quality, but more personal or more meaningful than just setting work on an online platform, which can be useful, but as the only means of instruction, I'm not sure it's sufficient for my amazing students. So basically, if you have stumbled across this channel, then apologies or welcome, depending. So if you are one of my students, grab a pen, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about Death and the Maiden and how this is going to be connected to the next text that we're going to be looking at, which is Brave New World. And so basically the reason that I started thinking about this was because we've been talking about themes of Death and the Maiden and the way that individual trauma and cultural trauma, political trauma all connect together, and how those traumas are resolved after justice has not been served, I suppose, but not even justice, but after the crisis, I suppose, has ended, and how do societies and individuals, and how do we, I suppose, as human beings, as a collective group, how do we resolve these things that have happened under a situation, under a dictatorship, or in this sort of dystopian world which is imagined as it is in Brave New World, which we're going to be looking at in a bit. And so I started thinking about this idea of dictatorship also as dystopia, because obviously revolutions don't happen because people want to create a damaged or toxic society. They happen because people are looking to create a utopia or looking to create a better society. And then what happens when that transforms into something that people haven't expected, and what the cost of that is, how people are able to make that happen, and what the price of it is, I suppose, for the society, the culture, the individual, the mind of everybody connected to this. Both victims, aggressors, and if those words even actually mean anything. So I thought this was really particularly interesting in terms of how the public is controlled, how we generate, how we move towards this dystopia, how it's constructed, how it's built, how people are convinced by this, and how language is used to do so. So I thought this was really, really interesting, particularly in, I suppose, with respect to the context that we're in at the moment. One of the criticisms of the strikes, and I'm not going to be political about this, I am not allowed to be political about this, and I won't be, but I do think it's interesting just to note that one of the criticisms of the strikes at the moment is that the protesters don't seem to have a focus. We have many different groups protesting. We have environmental groups, we have sort of indigenous tribes, we have people protesting against pensions, we have students protesting, we have transport protesting, and one of the critiques from the right has been, we don't know what they want, they don't know what they want. And I thought this was particularly interesting with regard to Death and the Maiden as well, this idea of recognizing that lots of different groups in a situation after a society has been through a war or a trauma try to piece themselves together. And so to a certain extent, each of the groups is trying to sort of redefine who they are in a transitional justice structure, which is really, really interesting. I started thinking about this and how language is used in Death and the Maiden to construct this kind of dystopian world. Traditionally, dystopias are, I suppose, kind of imaginary worlds. And 4 different kinds of dystopias have been imagined, which I found out today. I didn't know about the 4th one, ranking inside of this group, so I'm learning from this process as well, which is great. But the idea originally comes from Thomas More, who wrote a book called Utopia in 1516. And basically this book was, or this text, mejor dicho, this text is like a blueprint for the perfect society. And basically this is how a society can be constructed to eradicate poverty, crime, misery, preserve the environment, all of these different ideas. And so when texts are written that show the flip side of that, they become a dystopia. And there are common elements in dystopias, which are this idea of being dehumanized, which can happen either through technology or through, I suppose, in Death and the Maiden, through torture, through the disappearings of the country that could be Chile but might not be Chile. Also this idea of tyranny and disaster. And so what begins as searching for some kind of utopia, some kind of betterment of society and the individual and human rights, turns into something which actually is dystopian and kind of the antithesis of those things, and what price we pay cognitively as a society and as individuals for that happening. So I started looking about how, into how that works, particularly with reference to Brave New World. And we're looking at sort of 4 different types of utopias. Dystopia. So I'm just gonna look sideways so that I don't miss one. The first one we're thinking about is Orwellian, which is this idea of rule by an autocratic, totalitarian people or party. We've got limitation of choice, limitation of free speech, repression of minorities, order, routine, morality. Physicality and sexual freedom are repressed. And this is quite interesting because this is very much not the kind of dystopia that we're going to be looking at with Brave New World. But this idea of autocracy and totalitarianism, surveillance, censorship, there are definitely elements of that when we look at Ariel Dorfman's representation of the society and transitional justice in Death and the Maiden. So there are definitely elements of that, aren't there? Second type which we're identifying is Huxleyan, and this is what we are going to be looking at in terms of Brave New World because it was written by Aldous Huxley. Rule by democratic, totalitarian, capitalist, technocratic systems, limitation of access to speech platforms, assimilation of minorities, control by desire, debt, narcotics, technical necessity, and the implicit threat of violence. So that's quite interesting as well. Control of the physical body through pleasure and addiction to pleasure, but a lack of intimacy and connection between people. So that's a second form of dystopia that we might be looking at. The next one is Kafkaesque, and this one is ruled by bureaucracy, which is quite interesting. Controlling the population by putting them into writing, fixing names, surveying, standardizing, creating so much stress, bureaucratic stress, that people are also dehumanized and the system is more important than the human beings within that system, which is quite interesting as well. So obviously that comes from Kafka, and the promotion of hyper-normal, juiciosos, these functionaries who try and control the society through paperwork, basically, which again is another kind of hell, isn't it? It's another kind of administrative nightmare, just drowning people in paper so that they can't escape. And this is another idea of this dystopia, something that you cannot escape from. And that made me particularly think about the dictatorship of Death and the Maiden, in the sense that we begin with Paulina and her margaritas and we finish with Paulina and her margaritas. It's sort of an endless cycle, isn't it? An endless system in which there doesn't seem to be any progression. And the last one is Dickian, and obviously this comes from Philip K. Dick, who wrote the book from which the movie Blade Runner comes. And the idea of this is replacing reality with kind of an abstract or virtual image of it. And so the idea of technology and virtuality comes into that a huge amount. Things like the Minority Report, if you've seen that movie, this would come under that, I imagine, because we're looking at ways in which technology is used to create this almost hyper-real existence. Possibly The Matrix would be another one if you've seen that. If you haven't, and we have another strike, after watching my YouTube video, you will go and watch The Matrix, and also Blade Runner, and then that will make a little bit more sense. Okay, so I mean, as we're going through this, maybe just have a think of kind of dystopian worlds that you might have come across through reading. Something like The Hunger Games is a good example, and think about where that might fit in terms of this kind of world and what that might be trying to say in terms of warning us. Is it warning us? Is it telling us where we're going? Is it telling us where we are right now? Is it telling us where we definitely shouldn't go? All of these different kinds of ideas, okay? Okay, so back to this idea of language and this kind of circle of hell constructed by language, and how ooh, God, coffee all over the table. Rookie error, sorry. How language is one of the key factors in manipulating this. And I started thinking about how this operates in Death and the Maiden. And we have this idea of kind of weird things which create cognitive dissonance, where what you think is happening, what your senses are telling you are happening, and what your previous experience and knowledge tell you is happening, is not what the system is telling you what is happening. And so we end up with these very strange expressions, things like the real truth. That comes up all the way through the text, doesn't it? And again, it seems very strange to have to qualify degrees of truth. Surely truth is something which is absolute. And so that's one example of where this kind of cognitive dissonance can come out from language. This idea of euphemism, using expressions to kind of cover up the reality of what's actually happening. Things like irreparable damage. That when Paulina talks about this, she's actually talking about death. This also happens. There's a lot of euphemisms in the sense that things are not said. So we're not using phrases to replace unpleasant phrases. We're actually saying ... We're using ellipsis, and we're using omission to not actually use language, and the not using of language is as powerful as the using of language and the construction. Again, this idea of teensy weensy, this idea of sort of infantilizing things, minimizing them, is something which also can lead to a sort of cognitive dissonance, I suppose, socially. And so we talked about this all the way through social commentary, but I wanted to link this a little bit to how dictators also can use language, because obviously we're thinking about not an imagined dystopia, but a representation of effectively Dorfman's understanding of a real situation. And so even though it's disguised, it is quite clear that he is talking about Pinochet's Chile. And so while it's not a dystopia in the sense that it's not an imagined fictionary world, it is still a dystopia in the sense that it's dependent on tyranny, control. What was, I suppose, promised to the people was not delivered. And so again, we're looking at sort of dictatorship and the dystopian world that it creates, which depends on kind of suffering suffering, that's enough. It depends on suffering. And that very much connects to Brave New World. Something that's interesting, though, is that in Brave New World, people do not know that they are suffering. In Death and the Maiden, post-crisis, post-transition, they very much know that they are. So I'm going to give you an article which talks about the way in which dictators through history have manipulated their own language in order to control, move, shift people, and convince them that something that essentially is not good for them is in fact good for them. And that is definitely something that we are going to be moving towards in Brave New World. So, welcome to my channel. I'm supposed to say hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, whatever. I hope you have found some useful notes here, are beginning to see the connection with the next text, and that the article is useful. So goodbye.